Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the advantages and the disadvantages of a strong exchange rate. Okay, so here we go. Okay, the advantages of a strong exchange rate. So right in this example, I live in Santiago, Chile. So we are going to be talking about the Chilean peso. Okay, so in this example, the Chilean peso is going to be worth 450 Chilean pesos is going to be worth $1. Okay. Now I say that, and that's important because you can get super confused, right? Super confused in this wording of dollars strong and weak and strong and weak. And so the reason I want to put that out there is that a strong exchange rate means that the Chilean peso is strong against the dollar. Okay? Strong against the dollar. Okay. So, what would be the results? Well, if the Chilean peso is worth $1 is worth 450 pesos, then there's a strong exchange rate. I keep fumbling on that because I really want you to understand it. Then there would be downward pressure on inflation. Okay? So, if the value of the exchange rate is strong, then the price of finished imported goods will be relatively low. Why? Because you can take 450 pesos to buy a dollar. If the exchange rate were 710 to 1, it would take 710 pesos to buy a dollar. And therefore, those imported goods would obviously cost you more pesos. So imports cost you, relatively speaking, more pesos because you need dollars in order to buy those imports. Okay. In addition, the price of imported raw materials and components will reduce the cost of production of firms, which lead to lower prices for consumers. So if you're importing raw materials, say oil, and 450 pesos will get you a dollar, then the price of those raw materials or oil is relatively cheap, as opposed to the peso being weak, which is at 710, which is the next video. Then obviously you need 710 pesos in order to buy $1 in order to get your oil. Okay? The lower price of imported goods also puts pressure on domestic producers to be competitive by keeping prices low. Okay, so that is reason number one. All right. Reason number two is more imports can be purchased. This seems fairly logical. If the value of the exchange rate is strong, then the unit of currency will buy more foreign currency and so more foreign goods and services. This would include both visible imports, such as technology, and invisible imports, like foreign travel. If you're a Chileno and you had an exchange rate of 710 to 1, and then all of a sudden it got stronger against the dollar, and you only needed 450 pesos, then your vacation would become cheaper, right? If your vacation in the United States would become a lot cheaper, as would the ability to buy an Apple computer, an iPad, or anything. Okay, so imports can be purchased is obviously much cheaper when the exchange rate is strong. Okay. Lastly, a strong exchange rate forces domestic producers to improve their efficiency. The strong exchange rate will threaten the international competitiveness, so they will be forced to lower costs and become more efficient in order to maintain competitiveness. While this might be the result of more unemployment, there are other means of increasing efficiency that will result in greater economic productivity. What does that mean? That means it's actually pretty simple. If Chileans only have so much money, right, and if there's a strong exchange rate, Chileans are buying more imported goods, right, because it's strong, then those domestic producers, right, will have to get more efficient in order for Chilenos to choose their goods, because foreign products are now cheaper with the strong exchange rate. Then therefore, there's more competition for domestic goods. Does that make sense? And so therefore, if they can't compete, there'll be more unemployment as a result of a low exchange rate or strong exchange rate. Think of it as strong. Okay? So those are the advantages of a strong exchange rate. Now let's look at the disadvantages. Okay, the disadvantages of a strong exchange rate. We still have the same exchange rate, right? 450 to 1. The disadvantages would be damage to the export industry. If the value of the exchange rate is strong, then the export industries may find it difficult to sell their goods and services abroad because of relatively high prices, and this could lead to unemployment. So think about somebody who has a dollar, right? And last year, the exchange rate was 710. So $1 will get you 710 pesos. And you're looking at buying a Chilean tent made by Deutsche, which is a company down here that makes outdoor gear. Well, you're going to need, if it with last year was 710, you had an idea what the price was. This year, because of the strong exchange rate, you only get 450 pesos for your dollar. Then the export, the Chilean export, that tent or that tent from Deutsche is going to be, relatively speaking, more expensive for the U.S., and therefore exports are going to be hurt, right? It also, an export, you think about tourism, if there's a strong exchange rate, that dollar only buys you 450 pesos as opposed to 710. So the export of tourism, because that's an export, right? U.S. citizens would be less likely to come to Chile because of the strong exchange rate, because that dollar doesn't go as far. Okay. Now, lastly, the disadvantage for another disadvantage of a strong exchange rate, right, is damage to domestic industries. With greater levels of imports being purchased, increased competition, because imports are now relatively less expensive, domestic producers may find that the increased competition causes a fall in the demand for their goods and services. This may lead to a further increase in the level of unemployment as firms cut back. One really interesting thing that happened to one of my buddies here who owned a little factory of 10 sewing machines that made jeans here in Chile. All of a sudden, jeans from China became very cheap because the government lowered the tariff. And as a result of that, Chileans started buying the jeans that were cheaper. What were the jeans that were cheaper? Well, they ended up being Chilean jeans because imports were now relatively less expensive because of the exchange rate. This was 3 years ago. Then domestic producers may find it increased competition, a fall in demand. And Ismael, my friend, went out of business. He lost his whole company, right? He ended up having to get a job selling tires for a tire distributor. So that increased the level of employment. Why? Well, because imports became more competitive as a result of the strong Chilean peso. Okay, so I hope that video proved to be helpful to you, and we'll talk to you in a bit.